We're beginning this series. We're starting this series because I think we're living in a time, we're living in a culture that just seems to be constantly changing. And I think it's vital for us as Christians to consider, what is it that we are sharing? What is it that we are leaving, teaching the next generation? Now, we're called to live out our faith, and we're called to both share our faith with a younger generation. So, what is it that we're sharing? What do our lives demonstrate? What are we sharing with the next generation? That's what we're going to be thinking about as we consider this series, Legacy. We're going to be thinking about what are we sharing? What are we passing on to the next generation? And I want you to think of this in several ways as we move through this series. Number one, where are you? Right? Are you at a place where you're sharing? Where you're passing along? Are you at a place where perhaps you're looking at older Christians and looking at their examples to see what their faith looks like? We can think of this in terms of our church, our family here at Southbelt. What is it that we are sharing as a community? What are we sharing with the next generation? I think I've shared with you that when I was younger, I did not like to read. I struggled with reading. I was terrible at reading. I did the same book reports every year I could, as long as my teachers didn't catch me. You know what? They're a little more crafty today. They would probably have found out, Steve, you keep submitting the same book report. But back then we could get away with some things. It was Sam Houston, the Lone Star Leader. That's the one I did the book report on for a couple of years in a row. Only book I ever read in high school, I think. But it's ironic that I would marry a teacher. And I would marry into a family that absolutely loves to read, right? Brenda has tried to instill in our daughters the value of reading, and I can tell you that they love to read. Brenda's dad was just consumed books. I've always been amazed at how he could sit down and he would read a book in an afternoon. I just don't know how he did it. He just read and read and read. I didn't grow up in that experience. I played football. It was different. I ran, the only thing I read were plays, and X's and O's. And that was about, and that even confused me when I got to geometry. The X's and O's didn't go with algebra at all. So I was really confused growing up. But I married a woman who loves to read. And through the years, I have learned to appreciate and enjoy reading. Brenda and I, a couple of things that we do, a little nerdy, that our daughters just really appreciate about us, is we love history. And specifically, Brenda really enjoys the history of Galveston Island. And I've begun to enjoy that history as well. So we spend a lot of time exploring Galveston. We spend a lot of time walking the streets. In fact, we were just yesterday talking about a new adventure we want to go to down in Galveston to explore some historical places. But we also like books. We like bookstores. We like library. Our kids love this. Let's go to a new bookstore that we haven't been to. Let's go to a library that's out here in this little town that we've never seen. Our kids are just like, yes, let's go. They love it. So I say all that because you can imagine at least the joy Brenda and I had when we learned about the Rosenberg Library in Galveston. Have anybody heard of the Rosenberg Library? A couple of nods, yes, some people know. The Rosenberg Library in Galveston was named after Henry Rosenberg. He was a businessman, a philanthropist. He was a civic leader during the 19th century. He played a significant role in the development and in the growth of the city of Galveston. And he contributed many things to charitable causes, first and foremost was education and public education. I should say first and foremost. Very important to him was education and public education, public services. And so Rosenberg created the funds to have this library opened. And it was opened in 1904. It's still there today, still an active library, a working library. I would strongly recommend you go down and visit because it's also a historical library. And it's really, really neat. Some of the woodwork in there, Craig, you would love. I mean, just from the early 1900s. Beautiful, beautiful. It was one of the first libraries, I think the first public library in the state of Texas. But in addition to the Rosenberg Library, he also donated fountains throughout Galveston. And you can actually go today and still see Rosenberg fountains that he donated to public use. These fountains were donated as a way of just providing public drinking water to the population of Galveston. I didn't check this, I should have, but Bren, you can help me nod yes or no. But it was interesting about these fountains. Are we looking at one there? That one's down by the Railroad Museum on the Strand, if I understand correctly. But on these fountains, one side was for people. And then the back side of the fountain, it's not a very good picture here, but it was for your animals and your horses. Rosenberg left a lasting legacy of community service, of education. He left an imprint on the city of Galveston, one in which you can still explore today. One of the elements of our Christian faith is how it's been received from generation to generation. Our faith is a shared faith. It's shared through the story of Jesus. It's one generation sharing the story of Jesus with the next generation. I think it's fascinating. It was mentioned, I think, by Craig this morning about just sharing that story. How did you learn about Jesus? How did you learn about your faith? Most of us, I would almost bet, learned about Jesus from somebody telling us a story. It may not so much have been that one day we just happened upon the Bible and we read through it and we learned the story, although that is possible. But I would imagine that most of us learned about Jesus through someone sharing the story of Jesus with us. And that's how Christianity is passed from one generation to the next. It's in the telling and the sharing of the story of Jesus. So where do we find ourselves? Where are we? Are we engaged in sharing our story with others? The story of Christ. Are we someone who is looking to an older generation and trying to understand and see the story? You see, each of us here, some way or another, have a part in legacy and in sharing the faith of Christ. Where are we at? Where do you find yourself? I want us to look at the example of Timothy this morning. A devoted disciple and companion of the Apostle Paul. Timothy is one that reflects a legacy of faith that was shared, that was passed forward from his childhood. Timothy reflects a legacy that was formed by the Scriptures. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he writes to Timothy who's serving in Ephesus. And some there in the church, they're struggling against false teaching. People who were promoting a different doctrine than the doctrine of Christ. And Paul writes to Timothy that they are to teach no other doctrine than Christ. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 3. And it's within this context that Paul reveals a foundational truth about Timothy's life and his ministry. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. Now the purpose of this commandment, that is the commandment to share no other doctrine but Christ. The purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. I think these words capture Timothy. Timothy had a love from a pure heart, a good conscience. He had a sincere faith. And it was the role of Scripture and the story of Jesus, the story of his faith, that formed who he was. And it captured his ministry and what he was about. Timothy's story is kind of woven throughout the New Testament. We read about him in a couple of different places, and we see glimpses of his faith. We see glimpses of his commitment to Christ. But from his youth, Timothy had the privilege of being formed by the Scriptures. Paul comments on this legacy of faith that has been passed from Timothy's grandmother to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, when the Apostle Paul writes there, 2 Timothy 1:5. Paul is writing and he says, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, he's speaking there of Timothy, the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. I'm persuaded that it's also in you, Timothy. These words represent a legacy of faith that's been shared from one generation to the next generation until we're here at Timothy. But you see, Timothy's faith began several generations back, even further back than his grandmother. But it began in sharing the story of Jesus. I can think of my own life, and it's so interesting to me. This few words that the Apostle Paul pens here are very representative of my life. My faith has been formed by my grandmother, who shared the story with her mother, with her daughter, who shared that story with me. You can probably think of similar situations in your life. What are we passing on? What are we passing forward to the next generation? Lois was a woman that was faithful and devoted. Her life may have not stood out from anybody else, but what she did was she planted the seeds of faith in the heart of her daughter, Eunice. And that faith was a living faith that was passed forward to the next generation, Timothy. We read in the book of Proverbs that we are to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And I realize this is a proverb, but this is what it's talking about. Sharing our faith. Sharing the story of Jesus. And Lois and Eunice, they embodied the wisdom that's found in Proverbs. They wanted to pass on the torch of faith, and they wanted to pass it forward. And Timothy's mother, Eunice, continued this legacy of faith. that she received from her mother. The faith that she received was passed forward to Timothy. She was formed by the Scriptures. Her words were more than just words. They were formative in shaping Timothy's faith in his life. A man of sincere faith, of love and genuineness. You see, the torch of faith didn't flicker out as it was passed forward to Timothy, but it continued to burn brighter and brighter. And Paul's affirmation of Timothy is that Timothy was a man of sincere faith. It speaks to the authenticity, it speaks to the depth of faith that he received from previous generations. The legacy of faith that Timothy received left a sincere mark on his character and on his life. It's a life that reflected the words of the ancient Hebrew prayer, the Shema. The Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 4 through 7. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. This was the prayer of the ancient Israelites, the Hebrews. They recited this prayer daily. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. This was the faith that formed Timothy. It was the faith that was passed on to the next generation. If we continue in Deuteronomy, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. This pattern of devotion was evident in the life of Timothy. We see it in his partnership with the Apostle Paul, his dedication to the church, his commitment to spreading and sharing the word and the message of Christ. It's a faith he learned from his grandmother and from his mother. It was a faith inherited. And I think it's a challenge for us today. Perhaps even we can find inspiration today. Looking at Timothy, it teaches us the importance of sharing our faith. The powerful impact that families can have, the powerful impact that each of us can make on the next generation as we pass the torch of faith forward. See, we're called to be like Lois. We're called to be like Eunice. They imparted their faith with purpose. And today, whether we're grandparents, whether we're parents, mentors, role models, our faith, it's not our own. You see, we inherited a faith from the generations that served previous to us. And it's a faith that we need to pass forward to the next generation. And we think about the legacy that Timothy left, the legacy that his grandmother and his mother left. As we think about that legacy, what legacy are we sharing today? As his church. As Christians today, what legacy are we sharing with the next generation? Are we passing forward a faith that will impact others. Timothy's story, I think, demonstrates, among other things, that faith is not isolated. Faith is the story of Christ passed forward from one generation to the next generation. Our faith is shared. Our faith is inherited through telling the story. It's one generation sharing the story with the next generation. And I'm challenged to consider for myself, what story am I sharing with those around me today?